The last human's vengeance. You know what's worse than being hunted to extinction? Being the one who survives. Because when you're the last of your kind, you don't just carry memories. You carry a debt. And the galaxy? Well, they're about to find out what happens when that debt comes due. Let me tell you about a man named Thomas. Actually, scratch that. Nobody called him Thomas anymore. He was just the human. The only one left. And if you think that sounds lonely, you're missing the point. Because loneliness is what you feel when you're waiting for someone to come home. Thomas wasn't waiting for anyone. He was making sure everyone else paid the price for why no one was coming back. See, 3 years before our story begins, something horrific happened. The Galactic Concordat, this massive alliance of alien species, made a decision. They looked at humanity and decided we were too dangerous to exist. Not because we'd attacked anyone. Not because we'd started a war. But because we were unpredictable. We broke their precious rules. We threatened their comfortable, boring status quo. So they killed us. All of us. Every human colony, every research station, every ship floating through space. 7 billion souls reduced to ash in a coordinated genocide that made the word systematic feel inadequate. They burned Earth itself. They vaporized colony ships full of families. They hunted refugees across 1,000 light-years like animals. And they thought they'd won. For 3 years, they celebrated their victory. They redistributed our territory, divided up our resources, and convinced themselves that the threat was over. That humanity was just another footnote in their long, peaceful history. They were wrong. Because Thomas survived. And he spent those 3 years turning himself into something the galaxy had never seen before. His ship looked like it had been through a war, because it had. Scarred, patched, rebuilt so many times the original design was unrecognizable. But it flew. And more importantly, it killed. Here's the thing about revenge, though. Most people think it's hot, explosive, emotional. But that's not how Thomas operated. His revenge was cold. Calculated. Surgical. He didn't just attack random targets. He studied the Concordat like a scientist studies bacteria under a microscope. He learned their trade routes, their military tactics, their economic dependencies. And then he started dismantling their civilization piece by piece. The Nala hegemony learned this the hard way. For 6 months, Thomas haunted their shipping lanes like a ghost. Convoys disappeared. Military vessels turned into debris fields. And the beautiful part? He never touched civilian ships. This wasn't about innocent people. This was about making the ones who voted for genocide understand what they'd unleashed. Then Admiral Kethvar made a mistake. A big one. He contacted Thomas with what he thought was leverage. He'd found another colony ship, the Aspiration, carrying over 40,000 human survivors who'd been hiding in a nebula for 3 years. "Surrender," Kethvar said, "or we finish what we started." And Thomas? He laughed. Not the bitter, broken sound the galaxy had learned to fear. But something deeper. Richer. Because Kethvar had just given him something he'd lost 3 years ago. Hope. When Thomas docked with the Aspiration, he found Captain James Morrison, a man who'd saved 43,000 people while Thomas had been fighting alone. They embraced like brothers reunited after a war. And in that moment, everything changed. Because Thomas wasn't the last human anymore. He was the protector of a species that refused to die. But protection means different things to different people. Morrison wanted to rebuild. To hide. To give the children aboard his ship a chance at peaceful lives. Thomas had other ideas. He saw those 40,000 survivors and thought, "This is my army. This is my future empire." He stood before the colony's leaders and laid out his vision. Not survival. Victory. He would use guerrilla warfare, economic disruption, and psychological terror to tear the Concordat apart from the inside. He'd turn their own fears against them, exploit their weaknesses, and prove that genocide has consequences. Some people were inspired. Others were horrified. Because Thomas wasn't talking about justice anymore. He was talking about conquest. About building a human empire on the ashes of alien civilization. Dr. Mary Scott, one of the ship scientists, saw it first. She analyzed Thomas's attack patterns and realized he wasn't just hitting random targets. He was working his way inward, system by system, mapping defenses and testing response times. He was preparing for something bigger than revenge. He was preparing for dominion. The Concordat, meanwhile, was panicking. One human with one ship had reduced their commerce by 70% in a month. Ships refused to follow established routes. Insurance companies couldn't calculate the risk. Supply chains collapsed. And people started dying, not from Thomas's weapons, but from the chaos he created. That's when they tried diplomacy. They contacted Morrison with an offer: peace, reparations, recognition of human sovereignty. All they wanted in exchange was Thomas. They wanted him tried for terrorism. They wanted him neutralized. And Morrison, he actually considered it. Because he'd been monitoring galactic communications, and he'd seen the casualty reports. 2 million beings dead from supply disruptions. Medical shipments destroyed. Food convoys missing. Children dying because Thomas's campaign had paralyzed their infrastructure. The man who'd saved them was becoming the very monster the Concordat had feared. So Morrison met with the aliens on a neutral station. He listened to their arguments. He saw their intelligence reports showing that Thomas was planning to attack their homeworlds. 40 billion people on those planets. 40 billion lives that Thomas was willing to sacrifice for justice. Or revenge. At this point, was there even a difference? But here's where it gets interesting. Because while Morrison was negotiating, Thomas was watching. He'd infiltrated the Concordat's communication networks months ago. He knew about the meeting. And he knew about the fleet of 10,000 ships they were assembling to hunt him down. The peace talks. A trap. The promises. Lies. They'd even found the Aspiration's new hiding place and were using the colony ship as bait. When Thomas confronted Morrison, the older man realized how completely they'd been played. The Concordat never intended to honor any agreement. They were just buying time to position their forces. So Thomas made a choice. He sent a message to every government, every military command, every civilian authority in Concordat space. A simple ultimatum: total surrender in 72 hours, or face systematic destruction. No negotiation. No mercy. Just a cold, hard deadline. And here's the terrifying part. Thomas had spent months seeding automated weapons platforms throughout their territory. Devices integrated into the fundamental infrastructure of their civilization. Devices that could collapse the quantum foundations of entire star systems. He'd built a doomsday machine and scattered it across 10,000 worlds. 72 hours. That's all the time they had to choose between surrender and extinction. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The species that had committed genocide to prevent a threat now faced genocide from the very threat they'd created. Admiral Kethvar watched his civilization tear itself apart. Some governments surrendered immediately. Others, like the Nala, vowed to fight to the last ship. But everyone understood the truth. Conventional warfare was meaningless. Thomas possessed technology they couldn't counter, couldn't defend against, couldn't even detect until it was too late. With minutes left on the deadline, Morrison made one last desperate attempt. He asked for a conversation. Not a negotiation. Just a talk between two soldiers who understood the cost of war. Because somewhere inside that weapon of vengeance, Morrison believed the human being still existed. The man who'd once believed in diplomacy and peaceful solutions. The person who'd been broken by genocide but might still be capable of mercy. The galaxy held its breath. 72 hours to choose between surrender and annihilation. But in those final moments, they chose something more dangerous. They chose to test whether Thomas Harry was still human enough to be reasoned with. And that answer, that would determine whether mercy meant anything in a universe that had already proven justice, was just another word for survival. Here's what makes this story cut so deep. Thomas wasn't wrong. The Concordat did commit genocide. They did hunt humanity to extinction. They did deserve consequences. But when does justice become indistinguishable from the crime it's punishing? When does the victim become the monster? Because that's the real question haunting this tale. Not whether Thomas had the right to fight back, of course he did. But whether fighting back meant becoming exactly what they feared. whether survival required abandoning everything that made humanity worth saving in the first place. The galaxy learned to fear the sound of human laughter. Not because it was evil, but because it represented something they tried to erase and failed. It represented consequences. It represented the simple truth that some wounds can't be healed, some crimes can't be forgiven, and some debts can only be paid in blood. Thomas became the living embodiment of that truth. And 40,000 survivors had to decide, was he their savior or their damnation? The clock was ticking. The platforms were armed. The galaxy was watching. And one man held the power to reshape the meaning of both mercy and justice across 10,000 star systems. All he had to do was decide if he was still human enough to care about the difference. If this story grabbed you, if it made you think about justice and revenge and what it means to survive when everything you love is gone, hit that like button. Subscribe for more tales that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about right and wrong. Because in the end, that's what the best stories do. They don't give you answers. They give you better questions. And the question Thomas left us with? That's one worth losing sleep over.